Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Last week, we looked at a few of the monsters that show up in the Bible. They were pretty minor figures who appear here and there for rhetorical effect. Today, we're going to turn it up a notch. We're going to look at Tiamat. No, not the Celestial in the Marvel movie. No. Not that Tiamat, but the embodiment of chaos in the Babylonian myth, the Enuma Elish, and explore whether she shows up in the Bible or not. Let's dig in.
Tiamat is best known for her appearance in the Enuma Elish. The story is often called somewhat erroneously the Babylonian creation myth. In this myth, Tiamat is one of the primeval gods along with her consort Apsu. She is both a personification and a deification of the primeval ocean and demonstrates through her behavior that she is a force of chaos. After her consort is killed by a younger generation of gods that she and Apsu spawned, she is again disturbed by a still younger generation of gods, namely the storm god Marduk, who is the patron deity of the city of Babylon. She again seeks to destroy her own progeny, but Marduk opposes her. He uses a net, the wind, and a few other weapons to subdue and destroy her. And this use of a net is fitting because she is described as a kind of serpentine monster, so fishing gear seems to be an appropriate weapon to use against her. The text says Marduk split Tiamat in two, like a fish for drying, and he uses her carcass to create the world. He uses one part to make the sky, and he uses her spit to make clouds. He puts a mountain on her head and makes a place for the water flowing from her eyes to come out, which becomes the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, along with the other sources of water like fog and snow. Here we can see she begins as a kind of ocean, but becomes the source of waters under the earth. In Assyrian sources, Tiamat was associated with the saltwater ocean, while Apsu was associated with the sweet or freshwater. Now, scholars are increasingly seeing the Enuma Elish as a relatively late mythic tradition, or rather a later iteration of an older tradition. The Enuma Elish, in the form we have it, dates to at least to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, but likely a bit earlier. Its origin has been dated to the reigns of other kings, such as Sumu al-El, who was an Amorite ruler of Babylon, along with several other less likely options. So the dating of this tradition is all based on when the cult of Marduk was popular or became reinstated after a period of neglect, so it's not at all clear when the Enuma Elish was actually written. The mention of Adu among the final tablets, which list the titles of Marduk, leaves open a Western origin for the tradition rather than a Babylonian origin. Adu was the name of a storm god in Syria, so either this god was adopted directly or Marduk subsumed the attributes of this Western storm god. And that means the whole story may owe quite a bit to West Semitic traditions. When we look to other places beyond Babylon, we see other cultures also personify the sea, often either as or accompanied by sea monsters and dragons. At Ugarit, for example, the sea god Yam, who opposes the storm god Baal, is accompanied by a cadre of sea monsters who assist him, like Lotan or Latanu, a seven-headed sea monster. And we'll get into Lotan and Leviathan next week. More relevant for us today, at Ugarit, the deep is personified as a monster that is represented by the consonants THM, THMT, and THMNT, and likely vocalized as Tehom. In a deity list from Ugarit, a recent reading shows a figure named THMT, and that text makes it clear that this is a personification of the deep water. In Ugaritic literature, this figure whispers, converses with the stars, seethes or boils, is moved by lightning. This deep or abyss is where the rivers emerge and where El, the patriarch of the gods, lives. Throughout Ugaritic literature, Tehom, or THMT, appears as a deity who is active and important in Ugaritic ritual and belief. The idea of the personification of the sea or deep waters was quite common in the ancient Near East. The Egyptian god Nun was a primeval ocean and father of the gods. Namu was a Sumerian goddess who arose from the primeval sea and gave birth to the gods, or essentially the precursor of Tiamat in Babylonian tradition. So this personification and really deification of the sea was pretty commonplace in a very old tradition in the ancient Near East. Tiamat is perhaps just the instance best known to modern audiences, but does she appear in the Bible? Well, yes and no. In the Bible, there are 35 references to something called Tehom. Tehom is usually translated as the deep or something like that, but usually appears in the singular, usually without a definite article indicating it's a proper noun. There are a few places like Psalm 106:9 where it does appear in the plural. This verse says, "And he rebuked the reed sea, and it became dry, and he led them through Bata Hamot, as through the wilderness." Tehom and Tiamat have been linked both linguistically and mythically since at least the early 1900s, going back to the work of Hermann Gunkel. But what exactly is Tehom in the Bible, and what is its connection with Tiamat? Let's try to gain a bit of clarity on this if we can. We're going to back up for a second and we'll enter the fast-paced field of etymology to look at the surprisingly controversial issue of the relationship between Tiamat and Tehom. Now, we'll first start by saying that what I'm about to say is one perspective among many that is accepted within the academic community, perhaps even the consensus view, which is by no means the only view. There are several other plausible, even equally plausible perspectives. The words Tehom and Tiamat seem to derive from the common Semitic root word Tehom, meaning sea. Tiamat is a variation of this root in the East Semitic language Akkadian, and it has the at feminine ending added to the end. And the fact that the word doesn't have a definite article attached to the beginning with the at ending would indicate this is a feminine name. That's why we refer to Tiamat as a her, and her name itself reinforces her association with the sea. Tehom is the Hebrew or a West Semitic derivation of this common root. There doesn't seem to be a linear connection between these two words, Tehom and Tiamat. And Tehom is probably not a translation of the Akkadian Tiamat to Hebrew or vice versa. Instead, they seem to share a common lineage. So where does Tehom show up in the Bible? Well, as we mentioned before, there are at least 35 references to Tehom. More if you consider other water-related words that are likely referring to Tehom. And we're going to go through them all now.
Just kidding. Now, we'll just highlight a few places we see Tehom in the Bible. First, we see Tehom in creation accounts, namely Genesis 1 and Psalm 104. In Genesis 1, we see that the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of Tehom, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, it's interesting to note here that this seems to be setting up a primeval conflict the way the Enuma Elish does. Now, the ordering God is there, the chaotic deep is there, the reader's prepped for some action, but it never comes. Tehom is not a match for the God of Genesis, and they never even fight. God is sovereign, and he simply speaks creation into order. Now, Psalm 104 is likely the first written Israelite creation account, and Genesis 1 is based on it. Psalm 104 says of God, "He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. You covered it with Tehom as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains." Proverbs 3 reiterates Tehom's passive role in creation, a stark contrast to the role of Tiamat in the Enuma Elish. The flood narrative in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 is a kind of uncreation and a return to a primeval watery state, and Tehom has a role here too. In Genesis 7:11, we see that it is Tehom that provides the waters to flood the earth, and that God closes the fountains of Tehom in Genesis 8 to stop the floodwaters. We also see Tehom associated with accounts of the emergence of Israel. Tehom is at the creation of the world and at the creation of God's people. Exodus 15 says God has cast Pharaoh's chariots into the waters, and Tehom have covered them. They sank in the depths like a stone. A few verses later, it says that God used his wind to stop the water and let Israel cross. Now, inasmuch as Tehom has any agency in the text, it's usually as a force opposing the work of God. One notable exception is Genesis 49. In this passage, Jacob is blessing his sons, and in his blessing of Joseph, he says this: Jacob blesses him by Yahweh, but then names several other things that bless Joseph, including Tehom. Later in the Pentateuch, Moses also blesses the tribes, and in the blessing of Joseph, he also mentions Tehom. Now, in both of these places, Tehom is more personified than usual. It's said to be crouching, in a sense of watching and waiting. We also see in Habakkuk 3 that Tehom raises its voice and hands in both fear and surrender at the prospect of Yahweh's judgment. Clearly, it is subdued by the power of the ordering God. Now, these instances may echo an older tradition within Israel's theological development, in which Tehom was still deified, but in the text we have now, Tehom is decidedly a being who acts under the authority of Yahweh. So, to sum it up, Tehom is not exactly Tiamat, but we can recognize certain functional similarities between them. Both personify the deep sea. Both have roles in the creation of the world. They basically have the same name. So, how do we best make sense of all this? Now, this is a bit of a sticky issue. Tehom is not Tiamat, that much is clear. But in the biblical text, we're still left with a kind of personified sea that shares a lot of similarities with Tiamat, as well as figures like Thm from Ugarit. Yet, when we look at the biblical evidence, one key difference is that Tehom doesn't seem to have much agency. It doesn't act independently in the way Tiamat or the same figure at Ugarit does. It doesn't actively oppose the work of God. Instead, it always appears to be subdued by God, and this is a motif that is significant. Susanna Liu has highlighted this in her dissertation on the subject. She rightly notes that in the ancient world in particular, subjugators have authority over their conquest. In the case of Tehom, it is subjugated to Yahweh, and in the Bible, like say in Habakkuk 3, the subjugated Tehom serves to enhance the authority of Yahweh. His subjugated status serves to show Yahweh is all-powerful. And we also can note that Tehom may be personifying the sea, but it is not a deification of the sea. Again, Susanna Liu makes an important distinction for us. She notes, as it pertains to the ancient Near East, when we talk about a name personifying something, in this case the sea, we tend to assume it was functionally deified. Tiamat and the Ugaritic Thm are personifications of the sea, but are very clearly also deities. But while deifications are also personifications, the reverse is not always true. Things can be personified without being deified. So while Tiamat and Thm were deified, the Tehom of the Bible is personified but not deified. In the Bible, Tehom is a personification of the primeval waters, but not a deification of them. As Susanna Liu argues, we see Tiamat and the others as the deified deep, while Tehom is the personified deep. What's most significant is that as the personified deep, Tehom always serves to enhance and legitimize the deity of Yahweh. As Liu puts it, Tehom's personifications reveal Yahweh to his people, create ancient Israel's identity, and continue to shape the beliefs and ritual practices of Yahwism. In other words, the language of the deep retains its significance in the Hebrew Bible, but not to deify Tehom. Rather, invocations of Tehom describe Yahweh's control of the world and remind ancient Israel of Yahweh's transcendent power over every time, situation, and place. And we see this dynamic play out everywhere Tehom appears in the Bible. In the creation accounts of Genesis 1 and Psalm 104, the reader is waiting for conflict that never comes. Instead, we see Tehom as passive and depersonalized, having no agency, subjugated to Yahweh. Psalm 33 again illustrates God's control over Tehom in creation. Now, God also has the authority to remove the boundaries of Tehom in the flood and to reinstate those boundaries to stop it. In Exodus 15, Tehom does the bidding of Yahweh by being held back for Israel to pass through, then swallowing Israel's enemies. Psalms 135 and 148 even call Tehom to join in the praise of Yahweh, a sure sign that Tehom is subject to Yahweh, whose authority and sovereignty is without rival or equal. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give this video a like and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.